All right, guys. So in chapter 42, we'll talk about alterations in metabolism and nutrition. So metabolism is just the word we to use to describe all the interconnected chemical reactions occurring in your body at any moment in time. And so metabolism isn't just the processes that make ATP. They're also the processes, any kind of chemical reaction occurring in your body, we call metabolism as a whole. So it helps to create usable forms of energy for cells, and that energy can be measured in kilocalories. A kilocalorie is 1 calorie, like on a food label, but a kilocalorie is actually 1,000 calories. And a calorie with a little c is a unit of measure. It's the amount of energy it takes to heat 1 milliliter of water by 1 degrees centigrade. Okay, and on a food label, the big C calorie is actually kilocalories. So it's actually 1,000 calories there. Now, available energy is converted to ATP or NADPH, and it also produces a heat as a byproduct. So when you use chemical energy, you don't get all the energy in that chemical bond. Some of that energy that's used from the chemical bonds breaking, some of that's lost as heat. In fact, a majority of it's lost as heat. You actually only use about 40% of the chemical energy in ATP. The 60% of that rest of the energy gets lost as heat. And that heat dissipates away from our body as infrared radiation. So usually what I like to tell people is that if you could see infrared, like infrared light, we would look like glowing creatures because we're emitting light, which is infrared. We can't see infrared, so we don't see each other glowing, but we actually are with heat. It's kind of cool. So it's involved with maintaining body temperature, and metabolism is broken down into two main processes. We have anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism is the process where you can take smaller molecules and make larger ones. Catabolism is the process where you can take a larger molecule and break it down into smaller ones, right? So it makes sense that our body uses both. For instance, we would use catabolism of the food we eat. You want to break down the food you eat into smaller pieces. Once you've broken that food into smaller pieces, like in substituents, like individual glucose molecules or amino acids or lipids, then you can use those molecules using anabolic reactions to make human molecules. So if you ingest like plant molecules or other animal molecules, you can catabolically break those down, absorb them into your body, and then using anabolic pathways make human proteins. But you literally are what you eat. And I like to tell people, like, if that's the case, then I'm made of a lot of Wendy's chicken sandwiches. Before I was vegan. So, metabolic rate, you guys, we have basal metabolic rate, and it's the rate of energy consumption by resting tissue. It represents energy used in maintaining basic body processes. What hormone regulates BMR? Were you awake today? Thyroid hormone. Good. Thyroid hormone regulates basal metabolic rate. And normal BMR is between 0.8 and 1.43 kilocalories per minute. Remember, a kilocalorie is 1 calorie. So it means every minute you burn, on average, about 1 calorie, right? So that means if you've been sitting around for the last hour, you just burned 60 calories just chilling, right? Or if you've been sitting around at work for 10 hours, you just burned 600 calories at work. If you had a desk job, you're just sitting there. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting that it takes energy just to keep our bodies running and alive. That's the basal metabolic rate, even beyond like normal other activities. Now there are other factors that affect BMR, including thyroid hormone. Now carbohydrates are one of the main sources of energy for our body, and a typical human diet should consist about 45 to 65% carbohydrates. Now the source of this carbohydrates is important though, because if you're getting most of your body's energy from refined sugar like in soda or just pretty much most foods have sugar added, that's not a good source of carbohydrates. A better source of carbohydrates like complex carbohydrates from like whole fruits and vegetables. If you're eating an entire apple, although there might be several grams of sugar in that apple, it's not the same as several grams of sugar in a sip of Coke. That's not the same because your body treats them differently. In an apple, because you're chewing on it and the sugar is locked up in fiber, you don't absorb that sugar as quickly. So your body treats that source of energy differently than like, say, soda, where the sugar is so refined, it gets absorbed instantaneously. And it's a big shock to your system, which is also harder on your body. So it's not true that all sugar is the same. Like sugar in an apple isn't the same as sugar in a soda. This sugar, carbohydrates oxidize to form energy, right? And actually not making energy, you're just converting it. And it's metabolized from fatty acids. It can be stored in the liver as well. Now, lipids are one of the most concentrated forms of energy. You get the most ATP per molecule of lipid versus any other nutrient. So it's a very energy dense type of nutrient. And so lipids are first absorbed in lymph through chyle, and that's fatty lymph. And it's converted to chylomicrons, which are carried to your liver for metabolism and assimilation in adipose tissue. Remember, your liver converts chylomicrons into HDLs and LDLs. Which one was the good fat? HDL, exactly. And then the one that's associated with cardiovascular disease, LDLs. Now, liver damage can affect lipid metabolism. So, individuals that have a lot of liver damage might have higher levels of chylomicrons and LDLs instead of the good type of fat. So that could put them at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. Now, proteins are a nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen rich type of molecule. And there's 8 essential proteins, which means that they have to be supplied by your diet. Otherwise, there's about 12 or so other non-essential amino acids, which are ones that your body can make on its own, and they don't have to be made or ingested through diet. Now, when hydrolyzed, these proteins can yield individual amino acids, and your liver can actually regulate protein metabolism. So it can actually break down these amino acids or interconvert nutrient types. Remember, amino acids can be used to make sugar. So, let's say if you had a high protein diet, you can use those amino acids in the protein to make sugar for your body that your brain can use to run. Now, just some definitions, you guys. Obesity is a BMI of greater than 30 kilograms per square meter. And by definition, we have this BMI index. If someone has a BMI of 25 to 29.9, then we say they're overweight. If it's above 30, we say they're obese. And if it's above 40, we say they're morbidly obese. There's an issue with this scale, though, because it's dependent on body height and body weight. And so the reason why there's a problem with this whole BMI scale is that it's dependent on certain norms of body type, right? Like, let's say if you're short but very muscular, you might have a BMI that says you're obese because you might have, the muscle weight itself has some body weight to it, and if you're short, then it's not distributed across a larger body, so that that can give you a BMI that says you're overweight, even though it has nothing to do with adipose, right? In fact, some of the original data that was used to define these norms was based off a small sample of white males from Minnesota. And so it doesn't even apply to the whole population. So it doesn't make sense. But it is a decent marker to tell us whether or not someone's overweight or not. Obviously there can be exceptions to this rule, but if you have a high BMI, it's more likely that you don't fit the atypical category. It's more likely that you actually are obese with a high BMI. Now, there's some complex interactions, like lifestyle choices, environment, and genetics that can affect obesity. One of the genetic factors that I think is really cool is this idea of epigenetics. And it's actually a new field of genetic study where we're finding out that the experience of your ancestors affects their gene expression, and that is actually heritable. So the evidence for this is that if you had ancestors that lived in famine, severe famine, and they started to express more genes involved with energy preservation, well, it turns out you can actually pass that type of gene expression on to the next generation. Well, what if your next generation was no longer in famine, but they're still expressing the genes for energy conservation? Then they're going to be more obese. And that's the evidence for this. And it's a really exciting new field of study, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest the way your ancestors lived affects who you are today, including things like depression, anxiety, other psychological disorders. So it's kind of interesting. So you're seeing multi-generational effects from life experience of your ancestors, and it's heritable because it leads to gene expression. That just blows my mind. But obesity is one of those things that can be heritable based on how your ancestors lived. It's weird. Some key causes of obesity, though, could just be excess calorie intake. The FDA likes to promote this idea of energy balance, energy in, energy out, right? You should be able to consume the same amount of calories that you intake and then use those calories over the course of a day. It's very unlikely to actually ever achieve that, and it's not, your body doesn't treat all calories the same way. You're not going to treat a bottle of Coke the same way as 2 apples. Sorry, it's not going to happen. I understand that they have the same caloric content, but you absorb the sugar from an apple much more slowly than the sugar from a Coke, and so it's metabolized differently. So it's believed that kind of more processed foods, things that are more refined because they're absorbed more quickly, then your body has it's more of a shock to your body's metabolic pathways, and that's more likely to be what's associated with obesity. So what they're recommending now, and the FDA is changing their guidelines, is they're recommending now you want to have more whole fruits and vegetables, like whole foods, not the store, which I'm kind of grossed out that they want to put tattoo parlors now in Whole Foods. I know. You guys didn't hear that? Look it up. It's disgusting. I don't want to buy food from a place that people are getting tatted. I'm sorry. It's an organic tattoo. That's awesome. I know, right? No, whole food is basically like a solid fruit or vegetable, not processed, like a whole apple, not apple juice, an actual apple, because there's actually fiber in there and your body doesn't absorb the sugar as quickly. So also less meat, but we'll get back to that later. Now, obesity is one of the major contributing factors to different chronic diseases like cardiac problems, diabetes, cancer, hypertension, and stroke. In fact, you guys are looking at this list is the leading cause of death in the U.S. You're talking about cardiovascular disease, so heart and hypertension and stroke. These are the leading causes of death, followed by cancer. And diabetes is definitely a risk factor for these three, possibly even cancer too. So basically, another way to put this, you guys, is that the way we're living is killing us. And maybe the way our ancestors lived is also killing us, but let's not go there. Some possible treatments for obesity could be like bariatric surgery for like the morbidly obese to help them lose weight. Now, one interesting thing that we mentioned back in the diabetes chapter was this idea of a metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is sort of an odd form of metabolism that you see in individuals with pre-diabetes. They don't really have the traditional signs and symptoms of diabetes, but metabolic syndrome is associated with pre-diabetes. And it's associated with increased amounts of abdominal adiposity. Abdominal adiposity would be somebody who's skinny in the extremities, but has a lot of abdominal fat. I know you guys have seen those individuals before. That body type is associated with metabolic syndrome. And that's associated with prediabetes and cardiovascular disease. In fact, what they've shown is that individuals that have a lot more abdominal fat versus distributed fat, those individuals that have more abdominal fat but maybe skinny appendages are at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease than individuals with distributed fat throughout their body, right? Like if you're just sort of plump all over, instead of just having a lot of like a pot belly, the pot belly is actually you have a higher risk for cardiovascular disease. And that's associated with alcohol intake and that kind of stuff, as well as metabolic syndrome. Now, you're going to see a lot of free fatty acids, which can lead to atherosclerotic plaque, insulin resistance with or without type 2 diabetes, low HDL and high LDL, right? Hypertriglyceridemia and hypertension, and all of these can lead to cardiovascular disease. Now, some nutritional alterations of stress. We talked about earlier how stress hormones act to increase blood sugar. Okay, but they also act to help you retain sodium and water. So during the stress response, you're going to see that someone's going to have high blood sugar, sodium retention, water retention, and therefore hypertension as well. Now, this comes from activation of the sympathetic nervous system, causing a high metabolic rate, sustained catabolism, hyperglycemia, and salt and water retention. Now, the sympathetic response can promote the use of protein stores for gluconeogenesis. You might see some muscle wasting, as well as a negative nitrogen balance. You can get a lot of nitrogenous waste in urine with less intake. Fat stores are poorly utilized. So you can see muscle wasting, but fat, maybe adipose increases. And this can also lead to an increase in protein requirements. Now, in terms of malnutrition on different organ systems, you guys, the cardiovascular system is really sensitive to deficiencies in things like thiamine and selenium that can lead to cardiomyopathy. Protein malnutrition can lead to myocardial infarction, and starvation can be corrected by refeeding. But what's interesting, you guys, is that if you refeed someone too quickly who's been in a starved state for too long, it can lead to physiological damage to their body. So it can lead to things like heart failure. Although this increases cardiac output, it can cause heart failure. And cardiac cachexia or wasting is associated with heart failure and malnutrition, and that could be fatal. So on the respiratory system, you guys, due to low protein intake, we see decreases in the lung parenchyma from lack of protein, and increased compliance of the lung, which makes it a little more difficult to breathe. And this can increase the caloric intake 10 times normal. You might need more protein than normal. You see visceral protein loss from other organs. Respiratory muscle atrophy and surfactant production can be impaired. And because of lack of surfactant, they're more prone to respiratory infections because surfactant actually has antimicrobial products. We know that surfactant breaks the surface tension of water, but it also breaks apart lipid membranes, including like bacterial membranes. So surfactant's actually antimicrobial. Now in the immune system, lack of protein causes basically immunodeficiency. And we see that we won't have enough immunoglobulin or antibody synthesis or interleukin synthesis for inflammatory responses. Total lymphocyte count can decrease, and this can also lead to a decrease in lymphoid tissue mass, as well as circulating T and B T lymphocytes. And this can actually make individuals more prone to infections. But we just learned earlier that if someone had high blood sugar, that can also make them more prone to infection. So there's a delicate balance here between not being so malnourished that you can't have an efficient immune response, but not having so many nutrients in your blood that you're more prone to infection as a result. There's a good balance there, and under normal circumstances, your body should be able to maintain that balance on its own. Now, this can also, so like I said, it increases your risk of infection, sepsis, and fever. And infection and fever will increase your basal metabolic rates. So fever will increase metabolic needs by 7% for every 1 degree Fahrenheit. So you kind of keep this in mind, understanding how much nutrients someone might need in response to their fever. And energy requirements can increase by 40% if someone has a fever above 104. But when you're approaching fevers of 104 or more, that you're nearing like fatal levels. But they're also going to need a lot more energy to support that hypermetabolism. Now, nutritional support is mediated by, supplying additional energy, amino acids for immune responses, and so supplying substrates to prevent depletion. So it could be amino acids, lipids, or carbohydrates. Now, surgery can also lead to increased energy requirements. Now, one of the most important nutrients post-op is protein. Because your tissues have a lot of extracellular protein, in order to increase healing time, an individual is going to need a lot more protein to support that healing. And also post-operatively, you might see that they're going to have like a 10 to 35% increase in BMR, so they need more energy intake after surgery as well. And nutritional support is just going to be making sure that they have enough protein intake to replace any lost protein in their tissues and promote anabolism, which is basically going to be repair of those damaged tissues. Now, in terms of trauma, what we can find is that post-trauma, that can also lead to an increase in BMR and energy requirement. High levels of catecholamines can end up using a lot of fatty acids for energy, and you're going to see increased carbohydrate utilization, and this needs to be monitored in terms of complications. Now, burns can also lead to hypermetabolism, and you might find that someone has half to 100% faster BMR than normal. We said that a normal BMR was like 0.8 to 1.43 basically kilocalories per minute. But after burn, they're going to need about double that, right? That's their basal metabolic rate. So they're going to need a lot more energy intake. Proteins can leak from burn wounds, so they're going to need a lot of protein intake in order to replace those lost proteins. Cancer also leads to cachexia, because remember we learned about how cancer cells can use up a lot of your body's energy. And with inadequate nutritional intake, it can cause significant weight loss, muscle weakness, and anorexia. The cancer treatment itself can cause nausea, vomiting, and sensory changes that can also lead to nutritional intake. But due to the cancer, you're going to see that those cancer cells are so metabolically active that their basal metabolic rate's faster. The tumor uses nutrients to grow, so that we're going to need adequate nutritional support. The issue here, though, is that if someone's nutrient levels are too high, you're basically feeding the cancer, right? And so achieving adequate nutritional support is difficult with cancer. And there's a kind of an odd balance here where you don't want to give them so many nutrients that their cancer cells now thrive and divide rapidly, nor not so many nutrients that they can't support normal metabolism. So there's an interesting balance that can also be difficult to achieve. Immobility can also lead to a loss of calcium in your body, because we know that with your bones, either use it or lose it. And earlier I mentioned how astronauts are really prone to this, because in that sort of weightless environment, because they're not putting a lot of stress on their bone starts to break down. They get a lot of bone wasting, and their calcium levels start to increase in their bloodstream, where their kidneys eliminate that calcium through urine. What they're doing now is actually measuring calcium in urine to figure out the proportion of bone loss you're seeing in astronauts. And what they've done is they've actually invented devices to help astronauts maintain their bone mass so they actually can exercise up in space. Even though it's a weightless environment, you can still exercise up there. And from this last astronaut, I forgot his name, he's been in space for close to a year now. What they've noticed is that he actually has no bone loss. Whereas in the past, you were seeing about 5% a month or so. After a year, you're talking about losing over half of your bone's mass just from a year in space. But from exercising, they've been able to reduce that or prevent that loss. But obviously, you're not going to be dealing with astronauts. So, about immobility, people who are bedridden. Well, if they're just sort of laying in bed or bedridden, then you're going to see loss of calcium from weight-bearing bones, and calcium supplementation may be needed to prevent that loss of bone. And tissue mass can decrease from disuse atrophy, and they may need additional protein intake to replenish any kind of lost protein